Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Tate Modern. Thank you for coming. Just to introduce ourselves, my name is Achim Borchardt-Hume. I'm Director of Exhibitions at Tate Modern. And I'm also one of the curators of Calder Performing Sculpture. And Coxon, who's one of the co-curators, is sitting in the front row. And Vasilis Okonopoulos, who was the third partner in crime, he's in Saudi Arabia at the moment. I'm here tonight with Sandy Ra, who is the grandson of Alexander Calder, despite the difference in surname. We will come to that. And we will have a conversation first about the exhibition, because Sandy was also very much involved in the whole conversation around Calder and around the exhibition. So we will first really walk a little bit virtually, which always seems slightly perverse, given that the real exhibition is downstairs. It always seems slightly perverse to walk through exhibitions via slide projections on those occasions, but that's what we will do. To talk a little bit more about individual works, about the decisions that were made, how we came up with the concepts, what we tried to bring across, and you will be the judge whether we succeeded or not. And then...
but don't you think everyone's seen the exhibition?
Well, I never presume. There we are.
You're bad.
Never presume. And then after a while, we will just open it to the floor, so you can just all think about your burning questions to shoot off the moment the opportunity arises. So if we begin, literally at the beginning, this is the outside of the exhibition, Alexander Calder Performing Sculpture. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of Calder carrying one of his mobiles, quite literally performing with it. In terms of thinking behind the exhibition, there was a long-standing wish to work on an exhibition of Calder. But as with all of our exhibitions, we also wanted to make sure that it had a particular point of view. And the point of view, in a way, was quite simple, actually, to say, if one defines Calder by medium, then he would fall, as he does on our database, into the category of sculpture. Mostly when we say sculpture, we assume that it is a solid object, that it is a static object, that it's defined by volume and by mass, and that it incites the viewer to walk around it. That's usually the condition of sculpture. And from that, we thought, how does that actually apply to Calder? And of course, Calder sculptures work differently because they are, particularly the mobiles, not finite in their appearance. They change. They're not static. They move, even if they move slowly, much to the frustration of some of our visitors, I understand, who are a little bit more impatient and would really like to give them a knock. They change appearance. They are entirely constituted by their formal components, so they are abstract. And so really to think about how does that relate to the condition of sculpture as a medium, and in turn, how does this relate to live art, the way it plays an ever-growing importance now in the museum, and the idea that an audience witnesses an event together. So you will all see something which only happens in that moment in time, and we will see it together. So that was the thinking behind the exhibition, and now we can begin the walkthrough. This is the first room as you enter the exhibition, which contains a small number of works, 3 wire sculptures, the most imposing of which perhaps is this one, Hercules and Lion, from 1928. A very dramatic mythological subject matter, so in a way a very classical topos for sculpture, but represented in a very different way. At which point, Sandy, if I asked you to talk about Hercules and Lion and what it means, particularly within the context of the wire sculptures, of which we will see more in a moment, but this mythological subject matter, how would you think about that?
Well, there's something very strange that's going on here. I mean, today in 2016, we look at wire sculpture as something it's taught in every child class, art class, but it did not exist before Calder's time. So drawing a line in a three-dimensional line, a volumetric line, a portrait or whatever it might be, in space was a new concept, how you could delineate mass without mass. And it was very frustrating to people. Sculptors hated this idea because to take away mass, to take away voluptuousness, caressing an object, was really offensive, in fact. People were very offended by his work. It's hard to see that today, but it was super offensive. And also it was very confusing. It seemed like it was a sketch of something without it being the thing. So how is this a final work? And all these kind of questions arose out of this new invention. So he proposed that, he didn't propose, he made a series of works of identifiable historic subject matter to kind of help people understand what it was he was doing. So here's Hercules battling a lion, so that you could see, oh, well, you remember Hercules in another form, in another case, or Romulus and Remus, the great she-wolf who suckles these nice little baby infants, humans, which is the symbol of Rome. These historic, iconic imagery that is translated into these lines. This is a spectacular wire sculpture because it's also in suspension. So if we see, we expect now that Calder's going to invent abstraction and the mobile. So it's a suspended work that actually rotates. And it has this semblance of aliveness. I mean, that's what he's trying to get at, is in this more static, they're actually not static, the wire sculptures, since they tremble. You can't experience them like he intended because they have to be in a museum setting. You can't touch them and they're fragile. But imagine them in someone's house and you go by and the table gets kicked and the sculpture vibrates. It gives a sensation of aliveness. And he went a step farther and suspended this work and then had it be able to rotate. It's not entirely successful in that because it's not violent. I mean, there isn't a battle going on in the motion itself.
At which point it may be worth mentioning, actually, that your artistic ancestry goes back more than 2 generations, because actually he came from a family of sculptors.
Yeah.
Who did very classical sculpture.
The Scottish, the Calders, my great-great-grandfather came from Aberdeen, and he emigrated to the United States, to Philadelphia, and became a municipal sculptor and became quite famous, actually. And then his son, Alexander Sterling Calder, equally became famous. And then this crazy son, this guy, came along after. And my grandfather used to say he's the 3rd living and the 10th dead Alexander Calder, because there were many Alexander Calders that had preceded him.
But so he would have seen actually this very sort of typical monumental sculpture very close up, and the making of it. Very different proposition in the second room, or the link for the exhibition, which is a work that I was really, really surprised by when I first saw it, because it didn't look like classic Calder. It looks incredibly fresh, this idea of using these everyday objects, just placing them, and then the famous red ball that you can put into action, well, you can put into action, and that then swings around, hits the objects at random intervals, produces sound, and a pattern that is to a degree decided by chance, so it changes every single time.
It's an extraordinary object, and it's funny, I'll tell a story. Our friend Alfred Peckmore is here, and I had this sculpture out. It hadn't been exhibited for decades. Curators didn't know about it, mostly because earlier curators didn't want to show it because it wasn't a noble object, these bottles and things. It was confusing and so forth. I'll describe what it does in a second. But I don't know if you remember this day, Alfred, where I had it installed at the Calder Foundation in New York, and we'd just all come back from Venice, and I showed Alfred. I was in advance of an exhibition that was going to be at the Whitney Museum and at the Pompidou when Alfred was director. And he was really astonished by it. He said, we could have seen this in Venice a few weeks ago. It was so fresh and so youthful. So it's hard to understand exactly what it is, but it's these cast-off objects that are repurposed. One of the most exciting things about it is that he invites the owner or the viewer to organize these objects on the floor. So there's no perfect composition, there's no final composition. You put the bottles in the can and the wooden box and the gong wherever you want, and you activate the mobile, and then the little white ball goes around. From the heaviness of the cast iron red sphere, all this potential energy goes out to the little white sphere and it goes around, and sometimes it hits and sometimes it just misses these objects and creates sonic interludes, creates music that was very, very forward-looking. I mean, Calder's great friend Edgar Varese, the great composer, hated the music part, loved Calder's sculpture, and hated this musical conundrum of seeming chaos. But the intervention, it's almost, it's almost unheard of, this kind of thing where an artist says, here's the brush and here's the canvas, now you go finish it and it's my work. Now there are artists that work in that way today. I mean, we were just at a show of Darren Bader at Sadie Cole's here in town, and Darren's one of our prize laureates. And he's done these ridiculous things. He did an exchange with an artist, and he took their work and then made it a Darren Bader, meaning just by the act of taking it. And it's in the show for sale as a work by Darren Bader, but it was made by somebody else. And those kind of things causing that kind of confusion, he perpetuates these kind of inventive ideas.
Do you remember when you saw it for the first time?
This sculpture?
Yes.
I'll be honest. So I had seen it many, many times, but I didn't know what it was. It was a wooden box with some bottles in it in my grandfather's basement. There was a box with some bottles in it, and it wasn't very, it's just some bottles. Didn't know what it was, just bottles. There were other bottles too. But then there was this box with the bottles inside, separate from the used, the empty wine bottles and other things. It was a letter that my grandfather wrote to James Johnson Sweeney. In 1943, he proposed to Sweeney, who was working, curating the Calder's second retrospective, which was at the Museum of Modern Art. This exhibition was to be a tremendous exhibition at MoMA, and he proposed to Sweeney that this should be exhibited. And he made a diagram of the sculpture. And when I saw this letter, this letter and the drawing are owned by Sweeney's son now, who's now 84 and like an uncle to me, a great man. And he showed me this letter, and I was stunned because I immediately recognized that wooden box and those bottles as being cast-off objects in the basement of Calder's house, as being a work of art, but not just a work of art, a tremendously important, the first hanging mobile, and a work about intervention and a work about music, all these different issues that are brought up in this amazing work. So I had seen it many times without knowing what it was.
So in a way, actually, everything which is to follow is in the first two rooms.
Yeah.
All the potential is there. So the third room, which is dedicated to the wire sculptures. So we've seen in the first one, really, the sculpture comes off the plinth. It doesn't have volume, or it has volume, but it doesn't have mass anymore. It's defined by line, not by surface anymore, the way classical sculpture is. So the third room really is mindset much more, and looks particularly some of the circus elements, some of the characters which we will come to, like Josephine Baker, but acrobats are quite an important part. The circus was a very important experience and situation in your grandfather's world, really.
There are kind of two things. One is the subject of the circus as a thematic expression throughout his entire life, and not just literally the acrobats like are displayed here, but motion in space and things like that, which come from the acrobatics of the circus and his study of the circus. And then there's the work of art, Cirque Calder, which is a performance work made beginning in, well, he did things before 1926, but this particular thing is 1926 to 1931. And some of you may not know this work, but it's a, so here's a picture by André Kertész of him with some of the objects. Now these objects, it's owned by the Whitney Museum in New York, and it's in a hermetically sealed box. And you look at them and they look cute and they're interesting and they're amusing and you don't really know what it is. And you see a little movie made in 1961 of a fat old guy in a red shirt, but you don't have a sensation of what it was in 1927 or 28 when all of the intelligentsia in Paris came to see his performances, and some in New York also. But it's a work that is only existing in performance. So it's the earliest known actual work of performance or by any artist. I mean, there are the ballet russe and other things and interventions and engagements, but as a work of art entirely itself, it's an extraordinary thing. So there's these two components, and I always like to keep them separate because the actuality of the circus and the tent and the volumetric expression of the tent, which had a huge impact on Calder, volumes of space, and then the lines and the vectors of lines and energy in space. absolutely carried through his entire career.
But also there was something very curious about the way that you have this loop between popular entertainment, which wasn't actually just, I mean, popular always has this sort of slightly derogatory connotation, but actually the circus was an unbelievably exciting place to be. One of the things which I found very surprising was that many of the elements in the circus are actual portraits of actual acrobats or circus performers. They're not just generic. So when we come to this idea of the portrait, that actually the wire sculptures were used to portray particular people. And one of the most famous ones, of course, in the exhibition is Josephine Baker, who was a complete sensation in Paris at the time, and I guess defining a completely different way publicly of being a woman and being a black woman at that in the context of
being a black
Paris.
woman who was powerful.
Yes.
In her time, in her day. I mean, she was sensational, of course, and showing nudity and being, vivacious, but she was a powerful woman her whole life, which was an extraordinary thing. And my grandfather was, I think, inspired by and honoring that aspect of her.
There are how many versions? I mean,
this is the fifth and final version. There are 5 wire portraits of Josephine Baker. Well, yeah, I mean, there are other sort of things related, but literally 5. Possibly the first wire sculpture is an image of Josephine Baker. There are 2 sculptures he made right at the beginning of wire sculpting, just of wire, not from cork and leather and fabric and rubber and the other things like in the circus. Absolutely just wire. And it's formalized on a wooden base. It's only about this tall, the original one, and it's lost. It was sold in New York in 1927. We haven't seen it since. But this one is in suspension. Some of the other ones are also in suspension, but this one actually also has articulation. You can see her ankles, her wrists, her breasts, her neck. There are about, 18 different little hinges on it. So it can move and sway and can be quite active. We actually have a piece of motion picture of her being, he and she dancing together, and he's spinning her around and grabbing her hands again, just like you would dance with a formal person.
Now, what happens next in the exhibition, I think, is quite an extraordinary moment. And I think one of the things which is most extraordinary about it in terms of exhibition making is that it's actually a huge rupture, but nobody seems to mind. And usually people do mind when you do that in exhibition making. So I think that has something to do with the quality of the work and what happens within it. This room is very figurative and it's very narrative. You can identify the people. They have stories within them. The circus is very much a storytelling. It's something that evolves in time and has a plot line. And then suddenly you come into the next room and everything has gone abstract. And usually when one does that in exhibitions, people like to see a progression, but everybody seems to be very accepting of the fact that that has happened. How did it happen?
Well, the exhibition illustrates a quite severe break. He invented an entire medium. He did it for 4 or 5 years, and then he stopped, absolutely stopped. He didn't continue half measure and so on. He just stopped and became an abstract artist. I think, though, there's a flow that happens in the exhibition because you see the development of sort of the little wire sculptures, and then they get a little bigger, and some are in suspension, and they're aspects of the representation of energy, right? Aliveness or energetic forces, or even the line of Josephine's belly is a line that repeats itself. You can almost see it you see it in a later slide in Croisière. There's a line that runs through Croisière that's related to Josephine's belly. So he's reduced things down to the essential ingredients, and then eventually he reduces things down, quite quickly in a matter of months, he reduces things down to the essential nature of all things. And so what do I mean by that? His first exhibition of the abstract sculptures is called Volumes, Vectors, and Densities. Now, what is that supposed to mean? What's a density? And he doesn't explain it. He leaves it as an open question. So the works ask more questions than they're even proposing in the beginning, just through their presence. Just these wires that have no reference and no meaning, apparently, but are emotional. As he describes it as a very emotional work. Let's go to the next.
This is the first time where we have those frames, so the device of the circle that has elements suspended in it. And I mean, for those of you who have seen the exhibition, you may remember, but for those of you who haven't, this sculpture actually has an arm that reaches across the circle. So it's very three-dimensional. It's actually not just a ring with something hanging in it, but all the components can be moved against each other. So in that regard, it actually behaves quite similar to the mobile above.
Yes, this is 1931, the central sculpture, this hoop. So it's a meditation on the sphere. You've got a red, dense wooden ball. It's about this big. Then you have two flat circles that are intersected at a right angle that imply a sphere. And then you have a two-dimensional hoop, which is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional sphere. And their position together and their interaction together is quite energetic and exciting. But that's not the most important thing about the work. It comes out of the small sphere, heavy sphere, the one with the bottles that you have intervention. This is again, an overt work of intervention where you, the viewer, can take off well, don't do it downstairs, but you can take off the red sphere and you can take off the black sphere and you can rotate that horizontal rod anywhere in 360 degrees and then put the two spheres back on in your own organization of what's a proper composition. So, he never defined it as, this is my perfect solution, come up with your own. He said, there is no perfect solution, come up with your own.
Mm-hmm. Which is a very curious modernist device. I mean, to contest that there's a final, ultimate solution to any formal problem is a very modernist proposition. So people either do it in painting through seriality and making the same motif a number of times over, but he incorporated it directly into the condition of the sculpture itself. These ones, they are, that mobile actually is quite heavy. I mean, it was very interesting as an experience when you installing this exhibition, because a lot of the work you understand most easily when they come out of boxes, because they immediately do things which artworks should never do according to the rules of art handling. So they move around and they touch, which is strictly forbidden. This one is quite a heavy one. This one is it's quite slightly inert when you get it out. And the movement is more imposed really by somebody else. Just as understanding sculpture, the next objects had a different type of motion built into them. So they were mechanized.
Yeah, all of these works have motorized apparatus. The one with the black base is the earliest one, the pantograph. And it does this, there are three objects in space that do this balletic performance in a cycle. And you've got the lower ones from 1933, and then they go to 36. The orange panel is 1936, which has very complicated motion in the back. Every one of them, though, has only one motor, which then is translated into multiple motions through an exotic mechanism that was all devised by him. I mean, he basically takes a motor like from a sewing machine, he recycles it. He doesn't buy new materials, just recycles this thing and makes some wooden parts and apparatus, and often not a very good machine, these sculptures. He did say better a good sculpture than a good machine. So,
do we know in terms of particular like the work on the right-hand side, the little blue panel, which is quite striking because it's a little bit like a theater set when you look against it. Do we know how he read those works, whether he saw them as sculpture, as paintings, as objects, or did that not bother him?
Well, I'll answer it this way. The next picture answers the question, which is, this is the next gallery, which are these, this is winter of 36, 37, when he makes all of these panels. And so from the little blue panel and the orange panel, which is 36, all of these, none of these panels are motorized, they're all just open mobile forms. But this goes back to the visit to Mondrian's studio. And one thing I omitted in the story is that, so when Calder walks into that five-sided room with a cross light, on the back wall are cardboard, colored, painted by Mondrian, different cardboard elements that he repositions on the wall for compositional experimentation. And Calder says to Mondrian, you should make these oscillate. He thinks this is a great idea, especially in the environment, that the whole environment, these things should oscillate, right? You can see how the birth of the mobile is beginning. And Mondrian was irritated by that and said, my painting is already very fast. Like, this is a really bad idea. So my grandfather continued to work on that idea of a painting in motion, a literal painting, two-dimensional painting that had motional aspects. And with a motor, a motor has a repetition no matter what happens. You can make it 40 minutes, but it still is going to repeat itself. And he eventually abandons that and then makes all of these works, which are, as you stand in front of them in the exhibition, you're really supposed to perceive them as a two-dimensional plane that flash color and form, not really experience them as a three-dimensional object. They're supposed to be, mobile paintings.
I was quite curious when you see the ones from the side, how the perspective changes. You just mentioned the visit to Mondrian's studio, and Mondrian, of course, saw his studio really as a total universe. So these colored cardboards that were arranged, and the paintings were in between, and everything was painted white, which was very unconventional at the time. So the painting was one component in creating this total environment within which Mondrian somehow existed. Do we know what Calder's studio looked like at this moment in time?
Oh, it's very famous because it's wild. There was a photographer, Herbert Matter, a Swiss photographer, that made hundreds of photographs of Calder in his studio starting at this time. Matter arrived from Switzerland in 1936 to New York. They were probably introduced by Léger, and then Matter, and they became immediate great friends, Calder and Matter, and he photographed them extensively in the studio and then extensively in his exhibitions. So you can see this blue panel. You can see it in the Pierre Matisse exhibition of 1937, and you see it. You see some of these in development before they're painted, or as he's making parts of it. You can see a progression of the objects, which is a tremendous document. The studio is a workshop. He never calls his studio really a studio. He calls it a workshop. He calls it my shop. He made a painting of his studio, a view of his studio in 1950. He calls it my shop.
You just mentioned the exhibition in 1937 at Pierre Matisse. These panels, they have not been shown for a very long time. And one of the things which we tried to do was to find material which was perhaps less well known about Calder, to really tell this story of how he goes from early work to classic work, so to speak, in quite a consistent way. Now, this, of course, was in a way only possible with your help and with the Foundation's help, actually, because you took care of this work.
Well, this and the next object, this one, which is very exotic, this is the only panel, the only complete panel that has a geometrically painted background. All the other ones are monochromatic. And this white form is a piece of wire that's almost like a shirt collar, so it's quite big. And it floats, this line floats in front of the colored geometry. So when Achim suggested this idea that they wanted to do a room, not recreate the show of 37, which had lots of other works in it in the Pierre Matisse show, but present these panel paintings as an exclusive, as a group. I got very excited, and I said, well, we have two panels that were last shown at the Pierre Matisse show in 1937, have never been seen since. And it seemed like a great opportunity to present them. So that's one of the rewards for me, is to be able to put things together. When somebody expresses an idea, it reminds me of something, or something else comes together, and we're able to offer these two highly important works that are actually only known through the pictures of the Matter photographs of the Matisse exhibition.
Now the next one is, in the exhibition again, something quite curious happened. So we looked at the rupture continuity between the first room and the second room, and then between the third room and the fourth, so when it goes into abstraction. This was quite funny, because I think one of the things which is slightly difficult to sort of bear in mind is that Calder actually moves quite a lot between Paris, or between Europe and the States, and what the context of the times is also, because the work seems to be slightly outside that reality. Which in fact it wasn't. It was very much in that reality. So he worked in the 20s. He knew all the right people, so to speak, in Paris. So he was in the avant-garde circuits.
Or all the wrong people, as you might think.
And then, of course, in what happens in Europe, and particularly when you mentioned 1937, the exhibition at Pierre Matisse, at the same time In Europe happens in Paris, the World Exhibition, in which very famously the Nazi German pavilion and the Soviet pavilion were facing off each other. So you had this battle of ideologies enshrined in architecture. And the modernist masterpiece was the Spanish Republican pavilion, particularly famous, of course, because of Picasso's Guernica and this outright protest against what happened in Spain and the suppression of the elected government. Calder was the only non-Spanish artist to actually be invited to show his work in this pavilion. So that shows really how strong the connection was to the other artists in Paris. And this Mercury fountain, which cannot travel. Do you want to tell a bit more about Mercury fountain?
Sure. Well, they changed his name to Calderon so that he could be a Spaniard. It's a strange thing. Jose Luis Sert, who was one of the two architects of the pavilion, who became one of Calder's closest friends, was this Catalan architect. Miro already knew Calder. They were already very close friends. And Miro was doing his famous The Reaper, which is a lost, magnificent large painting also for the pavilion. And they wanted to represent the Mercury of Almaden, which was this town where the Mercury comes from, was this bastion of resistance to Franco's fascism. And they wanted to make something with Mercury. And nobody could figure out what to do. And so Miro introduced Calder, who had come back from the States for a sojourn for a year, introduced Calder to Jose Luis Sert. And Sert said, well, let's see what he can come up with. And he produced this fountain which pumps literal mercury. Mercury is very dense, those of you that know mercury, and it's very hard to move it. I mean, to pump it up in a system. So you have to also engineer a system that would move the mercury through the system and let it flow. But the mercury comes up out of the basin through these tubes and then funnels down through these kind of chutes, these quite typical Calder forms, and hits this paddle right here at the end. And out of the picture, up that line, there's a wire that goes up and another wire goes up, and at the end are these brass wire letters, polished brass wire letters, says Almaden, and it would fly like this defiant flag hit by the mercury, this sort of violent hitting down here to make this defiant floating up here. So really a very overtly political work.
And it's now in Barcelona and can't travel for obvious reasons. What we were keen to show was really that in 37, abstraction, this type of modernist abstraction, which I think particularly through its dissemination in the years after the Second World War, very often is seen as very pleasing and very nice, actually had at that point very clear connotations, because so much of the totalitarian ideologies was about stasis, about things being very still and classical and solid, and motion became political in a way. So these are the models for the 1939 World Fair in New York, which was the World Fair that put itself very emphatically against 37 in Paris and celebrated corporate culture, business really, as the saving grace against the madness of totalitarian ideologies. And Calder again was commissioned to make work for that context.
Well, in the end, nothing actually happened. These proposals, so you have to imagine that each one of these performative maquettes, imagine the figures being, 25 feet high or something like that, really quite large scale, and on the ground. So they would have some sort of mechanism underground that would run the apparatus that would make it perform and do its balletic performance. Each one of them, they do operate by a crank, or one of them is motorized. So those didn't actually happen. Much later, the one at the top was actually produced for the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in the early 60s. But so there was also a water fountain proposal that he had for the electric company to do this water ballet. So again, an ephemeral thing, right? The momentary jet of water was the work of art. And he made all these sequences and all these ideas about how you'd throw water in the air and create effects and so forth. Something that we'd actually like to one day try and produce.
In the next room, we return really to abstract work of quite a different kind. It's getting much bigger now, and they are standing on the ground. So they clearly have a sort of vaguely person-like, people-like appearance and dimension. Balance becomes more precarious in them. And central to the whole room is one work at the far end, which is the universe, which is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And the spheres, the boards, they can be moved around when you install it. Then you have to define the position and lock it down, and that's how it's being shown. This whole idea of planets and the universe, which comes up time and again, that people make this connection between those works. And it's just, okay, more than horrible?
So actually, this has a whole motorized mechanism that's behind the wall, and it's never shown with that motorized mechanism, as it's never shown in operation, although sometimes we can present a video or something in operation. It has a sequence where the red ball actually rides up that wire, and the white ball rides up that S-form wire. And this is one of the ones that has about a 40-minute sequence where if it begins with the red ball all the way down and the white ball all the way down, they both go up and they come down, and the white ball comes down second. And then it keeps going, and they get farther and farther and farther apart, and then they start to get closer, 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 and then finally they both touch down at the same moment 40 minutes later. And it's an impossible thing to calculate how long and what kind of sequence and so on. This is famously the work in 1934 that Albert Einstein stood in front of and couldn't calculate the system, and so literally stood there for 40 minutes until it repeated itself. And he said, okay, I got it. You know, he couldn't figure it out. But the title of the work is A Universe. And unfortunately, this thing happened where critics of the day, they figured that the prior 3 years of volumes, vectors, and densities, and arrested movements, and these other bodies of work, which were really difficult to understand what they were, one critic decided that this was the universe, meaning the red sphere is the sun and the white sphere is the moon, and it's as simplistic and pedantic as that, and then wrote about all the universes, meaning the last 4 years were reduced down to this idea that, oh, Calder's just depicting the solar system, which is exactly what he's not doing. It just doesn't look like the solar system. You've got the two hoops that intersect that define this gaseous or permeable sphere. It could be, you know, a galactic scale. It could be a microcosm. It could be anything. It isn't anything. But he was exploring at that time, what is the essential nature of everything? What is the binding force of everything? What brings us to an understanding of the universal? And reducing that down and saying, oh, it's just the universe, is a great disservice to what his explorations really were. So I wish he had titled this something other than A Universe, because it's really the piece. And then it quite rapidly, it entered MoMA's collection right at that time, so it became an iconic Calder of the period. And then universe became this definition. And instead of, for instance, Calder writes about, he describes very, very well, he was on board ship going through the Panama Canal. He was off Guatemala. He was going to San Francisco from New York. And he always needed a lot of air. So he slept on board ship on the deck on a coil of rope. And he woke up one morning at 5:30 in the morning, and the sun was rising, this giant disk of a sun, and the full moon was setting on the opposite horizon. Really an extraordinary moment. And he talked about the immense grandeur of that moment. He didn't talk about how the sun is a red disk and the moon is a white disk or a sphere or whatever. He talked about the immensity and the grandeur of that moment to him. And that was the inspiration, was, you know, he actually did a famous engraving called Grandeur Immense, which was about how he felt. And it doesn't depict that moment at all. It's about objects floating through space in a very different way.
No, in that room, I mean, if you go back for a moment, so there are the standing sculptures. There are also these really beautiful works on the walls, which I absolutely love, like the one at the back.
Can we go back 2 slides?
Yes.
This one. So this object, oh no, sorry, not this one. This one, this tripod with that red disk that is not the sun and that white disk that is not the moon. This is also 1934, the same year he made A Universe. And it's the second work he made for the outdoors, meaning that he buys this property in Connecticut in 1933. It's the first property he owns. It's a little farm, it's 18 acres, and he has some space to work, and he starts to make works for the outdoors. And he made 2 of these tripod works where you take the tripod out to the soil and you push the ends of the tripod into the soil, make it very rigid, and then the mobile does its performance on top. But I just wanted to point out that that's also the same year as A Universe. It shows the diversity of what his vocabulary. He's making outdoor sculpture for the first time and making this motorized balletic thing, which is very delicate and sensitive.
But so they still have a relationship to the ground. They rise from the ground. And then, of course, what happens in the next room is that disappears almost altogether. I mean, It's a combination of mobiles and of sculpture on the ground. In a way, that room is the heartbeat of the exhibition, really. In terms of just, it's always very interesting when you install exhibitions, you learn a lot about the work just by how it behaves, how it's physically, what's it like physically to experience it. They are, this was very difficult to install. They are very unruly. They come in very complicated, beautifully built crates from many different places, but big crates, which is one of those things which one easily forgets when you look at those things and you think, what are they actually like as real things? The moment they can lift out of the crate, they do this, as I said before, and for art handlers, really terrible thing that they immediately begin to move and change their shape, and they're not that easy to handle. So then it was really how to bring them together in one room and to create a landscape of different types of mobiles. And actually what we tried to do was, within the family of mobiles that we chose, to play with very different qualities of individual ones. One particularly stunning one is this one, which is Gamma. Now, what I like about it is that the vertical part is a sort of correspondent to the horizontal part. So they play with those fundamental conditions. How much do we actually know about the making of those things?
Well, he made, in the late 40s, 47, 48, and 49, so after the war, it's a very optimistic time. I mean, America has recovered from the war. Europe has not, but by 48 and 49, there's this tremendous optimism about everything. And it's not a body of work, but there's this almost a series of these horizontal and vertical mobiles. One of the first ones was a commission for a stairway in a Marcel Breuer house. So you know, as you circumnavigate the stairway, a piece of the mobile hung down and a piece of the mobile hung across. And so as you approach the upper section, you'd see the vertical section. As you came from above, you see the horizontal section. And it was about engaging different aspects of space from different positions. That's where the idea sort of began. Why it's called Gamma, I don't have a clue.
One of the things which was very curious is, I mean, the mobiles that one popularly knows. So the you think it's the shape of the letter? Yeah. It's always very difficult with the titles. It may well be. One of the things which was very curious is that the mobiles that one popularly knows, and of course there's always this uneasy relationship between Calder's mobiles and the mobiles that ordinary people have in their houses, not those fortunate enough to own Calders. But the interesting thing is...
Those aren't mobiles. Those are just crap.
Well, lots of people like them, but when you build them, it's all about perfect sense of balance. So these individual elements, you're meant to suspend them so that everything is on a complete horizontal. One very obvious thing is that never happens actually in Calder mobiles. They are not constructed like that. And when you look, for instance, at the back of this one, there's one which is this fantastic thing of the sticks, almost like an instrument with 2 elements suspended. There are the white ones, the one up there, and there's a very beautiful big white one opposite Snow Flurry from MoMA. And then there's a little one down on the lower right, which is this fantastic shadow play of a sea of lines crisscrossing. If we can once more go back to the making of those things, because they're not pre-planned, really. I mean, there are no construction drawings in the archives.
It's funny, people focus on that Calder studied mechanical engineering at Stevens Institute, and of course, growing up in a family of artists, he was in not only his father's studio, but his grandfather's studio, and quite obviously, the origin of the wire sculpting comes from the armatures that these fantastic sculptors use. They create a rod or a wire to create a structure to hold the clay in place. They need a steel armature. They can't be self-supporting until it's dry or kiln dried or whatever. So it's easy to understand now that the origin of the line of the wire in space originates with him as a child. And he was very mechanical as a child. We know so many things about his development as a boy, and all kinds of things that he made, and things that he made that were kinetic and so forth. How he used tools, how he'd take one piece of metal and make something very complicated out of it, and so on. So yes, it's a process that seems to be somewhat mechanical when in fact it's totally intuitive. So there are better sculptures as an example than Gamma, but because Gamma is just discs. But if you imagine forms, and you think about Calder with a sheet of metal and drawing some lines right on the sheet of metal, not on a piece of paper and transferring or anything, and then cutting those out with a snip, and then refining the shape with a file and making a system of resonant shapes. Not the literal same banana shape that's a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, but shapes that have a resonance. A boomerang, but this one's a little more open, this one's a little more closed, or something else. He would make those shapes in groups and in sequences, and then after he had a bunch of shapes made or had an idea about a central shape, he'd start to lay those shapes out on a table and, rather like collage, organize them and the interdependentness of each one to each other, and then start stitching them together with wire and balancing them, and along the way, change the idea. So he'd have it flat on a table in a certain sequence, and as he stitched it together with wire, he'd realize this element, when it comes up off the table, should really be like this. And you can see that in certain works. We have a fantastic example in the Foundation in New York, where you can see how he cut them out and thought about them, how he cut them out and refined them, and then changed his mind in stitching them together in this very intuitive way.
And eventually this reaches an incredible level of virtuosity. So I think at the point where the next step in the exhibition, where there are those three mobiles together that actually can produce sound. So they have a little gong as one of the elements, and this is one of them, red gong. And it's almost like a dragon's tail. It has this sort of majestic, very slow sweep as it moves around. When did this idea of introducing sound first arise, apart from the... Well,
that's where it begins, in 1932 with those bottles.
Yeah.
That's the first musical work, overtly musical work. I mean, some sculptures have elements that collide intentionally because he also disrupts motion to create other forms of motion. So it's not just so mechanical in appearance. But the first gongs that we know of, I mean, he made some in his Paris studio in 1933, right after making the bottle one. But the first really formal one we're certain of is 1940 that he made for the Roxbury studio in Connecticut, which is a big disc of canvas that's painted red on one side, which is not a drum, and it's suspended from the drum stick, which is quite large, and then there's a brass disc, which is the gong, and the system of the mobile, and the hammer part, the drumstick, can come around and strike the brass gong, but it can also miss the brass gong if the brass gong is in a different orientation. It's just hanging from a string. So it could be at a slight angle and just be grazed and make the most delicate little sound. And the big disc below is actually what's creating another form of its motion. And if you were in the studio with him and if it was your first visit and you were a curator and you're very excited to be there, and he opened up the windows for a little ventilation, all of a sudden, after you were there for 15 minutes or maybe 40 minutes, all of a sudden, wham, would be this huge sound. I mean, really a huge sound. Not a delicate gong like this one makes downstairs, but you literally jump out of your skin because it was so unexpected. It's huge. So that's the gong from 1940. These kind of begin in 1948. We know of one from 48 that we own. And then this is moments from 1950. The Metropolitan Museum.
Oh,
Yeah.
The glorious conclusion to the exhibition is this very large mobile Black Widow, which comes from the Institute of Architects in Sao Paulo and was given to the Institute by Calder as a present. And we come a little bit in a moment to Calder in Brazil. It's been in the building ever since. It took about 90 architects who formed the board of the Institute to agree that it could actually leave the Institute and come to New York first, to the foundation to be restored, and then to come to Tate, and then it will go back into the Institute and be reinstalled. There is a...
there we go, that's better.
There's one image where you can see the setting, not for which it was made, because it wasn't made for the place, but in which it was originally displayed. So these very large mobiles, this is pretty much one of its kind. There's a couple more of...
It's huge. It's a huge sculpture, and you think about 1948 and Calder's making works for domestic use, for people's homes. He wasn't this idea of the Tate Modern, and now you're getting even bigger, you guys. You make these giant spaces for Richard Serra, and Richard's thinking about a 100-foot tall sculpture, right?
Let's not go there.
Well, Calder, sorry. Calder also made some 100-foot tall sculptures. But in 48, he was thinking about things for people's homes. So he showed this at his exhibition in Brazil. He had a show in Rio that was so popular, went to Sao Paulo right after, and this mobile was a central element of that exhibition. And nobody bought it because no one really had a house at that time to suspend such an exotic and large object. And so he gave it to this Institute of Architects, and I think, he made a lot of friendships with architects while he was in Brazil, and he also made a lot of friends with Brazilian samba dancers. But he decided to not bring this home, but he just thought it should remain in Brazil, should be part of the Brazilian scene. And there are about 400 members of the Architectural League that he gave it to. It wasn't a commission for the space, but it looked quite good there. I think it's...
But there was something very congenial about that moment and that place, that you have a country that wants to build a new society, really welcomes modernism as a language. And there's a synergy in that with Calder's mobiles. And a similar synergy is there in a different way. So this was the other moment which took quite a bit of work to get going. Richard, who's in the audience, was one of the partners in crime on that one. This was a work that Calder made actually for a performance for chef d'orchestre, and that we brought back into the Turbine Hall after, it is in a private collection at the moment. It has not been performed on for a very long time. Do you want to tell a bit more about chef d'orchestre?
Sure. Well, there was this amazing mid-century American composer named Earl Brown who was very affected and inspired by Calder's mobiles, meaning the open form composition had a direct effect on how he sequenced his own work. And he left certain parts open for interpretation and variable and so forth. He actually used the word mobile in his score and open form and so on. And he met Calder in 52 or 53, introduced John Cage, sent him and another fellow up to Connecticut, and they met and they talked about this resonance of mobile structures. And later, Earl Brown got a commission from the Paris Opera commissioned a quartet from Earl Brown, and Earl had always had this idea of having a mobile that its motion would conduct the performance. So every time it moved, something would happen and the orchestration would happen. So a piece could be 12 minutes long or it could be 22 minutes long, but it's the same score. And through discussions with Calder, Calder proposed that the sculpture should maybe be a percussion instrument. It was actually it was a score for percussionists. So he said, why don't you use a mobile that is a percussion instrument? I'll make one. And he tuned each one of these elements for hammering, for playing. They're sonic. And it was performed in '66, and it went on and had a life. And eventually, through a somewhat mysterious process we won't go into, it got sold. It should have been in the public forum, but it got sold, and then it was sold many times. And it's owned today by a nice couple that didn't realize it was a musical instrument. They just saw it as a Calder sculpture, a nice Calder sculpture, and that it's in their living room in a big house, and they think it's great. And so it took, as Achim was saying, it took a lot of politics to engage them and inform them and get them to lend the work, not just for an exhibition at the Tate, which wasn't what it was for, but to actually perform it, meaning hit it with sticks. And if you own a Calder sculpture, you probably don't want people hitting it with sticks. So that was a huge challenge, and it took a lot of people a lot of work to be able to perform it.
But there was an extraordinary thing, because I think one of the, it was a truly magic moment. I would urge everybody, if you haven't seen it, on the website to take a look at it. It's quite extraordinary, quite mesmerizing to see. There were 4 performers from the Guildhall School of Music who played it with Richard's guidance. The important thing is the beating on them, which obviously put the heart of the lender a little bit at a faster pace. They weren't quite beating on it. They were playing it very gently. This is, again, this common perception also around the mobiles. They're not meant to be in mad sway. They're meant to move gently. There's a sort of particular momentum dimension to the whole experience. But aside, of course, from considerable determination on our side to make this happen, it obviously also took a lot of persuasion from your end. So before we open to the floor, if you were to summarize, because it's always a very interesting question, the role of the foundation, what does it actually mean to be charged with the lot of taking care of an artist's legacy? How would you describe that, what you actually do?
Well, every exhibition is a unique experience, just like every one of these works of art. And how you handle it, how you install it, where you install it, how you consider it, is quite like how we engage an institution in partnership. Sometimes we're partners and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're just a lender and we provide historical advice on things, or help to give advice about a manuscript or something. Obviously, we're very involved with this exhibition. We were super excited, and you loved the engagement, and your team was amazing and really informed. And sometimes curators aren't so informed. I don't know if you know that, but it was tremendous experience and resonance with my staff to have this really great dialogue. It's a strange thing to be responsible for someone else's legacy. It is a strange thing. But it's very gratifying, and it's very rewarding to see sculptures hung the way the artist intended them to be hung, for instance. Sometimes a museum says, we don't want somebody touching it, so we'll hang it up near the ceiling. You imagine in this room hanging a mobile, it would be horrible, it would be terrible. It would be a terrible kind of installation with all that chaos of geometry. So that's one of the great gratifications.
But you have an enormous archive, a large number of works, so it's a very rich representation of Calder's work. But you also extend that into carrying forward, I guess, the spirit of Calder in a different way through the artist residencies in France. So in the studio, and Abraham Cruz-Villegas, who was the first artist commissioned to make a Hyundai commission in the Turban Hall this year, so the triangle growing downstairs. He was one of the artists who was actually in residency. And at the moment, there's also an exhibition at Pace Gallery of the artists who were prize winners of the Calder Prize for young artists. So there's both preservation of historic legacy and of extending it into the present and future.
Yeah, I think I'm personally excited by contemporary art and the contemporary culture and the current dialogue. And I'm especially excited when I discover that an artist is working in a vocabulary that Calder had at one point, or did his whole career, that is sometimes not quite understandable or visible. The show at Pace, which just opened last night, is the 6th Calder Prize winner. So this is a prize for young artists. It's a biannual prize. It's a $50,000 cash prize, and then all of the artists have gone to our Atelier program with Alfred Beckman as our president, and they go and they produce new work, and some of them have dramatic changes in their career, and I don't mean because it's so glamorous, I mean they have a different experience there and create a whole new body of work, and so forth. But I do recommend, after seeing the show here, to see the small show that's at the Pace Gallery in the Royal Academy there, and see that there's a resonance between these artists that's not a visual resonance. It's not people who make mobiles. It's this resonance of ideas. And it takes some time, and you should talk to the dealers there, because they know a lot about who these artists are and what they're doing. It's very exciting. It's very fulfilling.
Any questions from the audience? Joseph is the one with the microphone.
He's going to get some exercise.
Oh, thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. One thing that wasn't mentioned, and I'm not a huge expert on Calder, obviously, colour. How does he select his colours? And is there symbolism? Can you speak about the colour, please? The way he selects colour.
Well, Calder famously wrote that red was his favorite color. He'd like to paint the whole world red. But actually, if you study his work, which we do, we've documented now about 22,000 unique works that he made in his lifetime. His favorite color is black, by about 85%. I mean, wildly black. It's black because it's neutrality. It's not some sort of existential color. It's not about the otherness or the vacuum or whatever. It's about neutralizing a plane so that it's the edge of the plane, meaning where the physical object meets the non-physical, that edge of a form has this kind of resonating effect. And he just wanted the plane to be neutral. Sometimes he made things red, or sometimes he made it black in a model, and then when it was made into a large sculpture for a commission or something, he'd change the color to red because of the building was black glass, curtain wall, international style building, and he'd make it red instead of black just so it could be seen. But he talked about color as, one of the quotes is about using color like signals in a waterway. So a small thing that was bright or a bigger thing that was less bright, but they would somehow be equalized. So there'd be a blue disk and a small red sphere, and that they would be almost the same resonance, even though one was much bigger than the other. So there isn't meaning in the color. It's not about meaning. It's about a resonating effect or an activity. So you won't find 4 big red spheres and 1 little white one. You'll never find that in a Calder sculpture. You'll find maybe some black things with a little white one, or you'll find big white ones with 1 little red one. If you see what I mean, they had to find a harmonic balance through the use of color. Vibration, very good word, exactly. And it's a misnomer to think that Calder worked only in primary colors, because it's absolutely not true. He used bubblegum pink and green and all kinds of things at all different types and all different, as a painter and all the different things that he did. The idea that the simplified palette is, just what Calder did is nonsense.
But there's a core range which is recognizable. There's a sort of particular dynamic between the black, particularly the black. Sometimes they're completely leaving it all out. I think pure white is extraordinary. But then, I think gamma, in a way, that's also why I thought it was such an striking work in there, very much sort of gives that sense of what that palette.
Yeah. Well, you see that the horizontal members are neutral, and that these diagonally opposed vertical are the colorful ones. It's actually a very complicated composition colorfully. It's hard to see it in a screen projection, but if you stand in front of the mobile, you'll understand that, see, the yellow has a dynamic interplay with all the reds. If it was all yellow, it would be an entirely different thing, obviously.
Yeah, fantastic to see again Snow White when you see it, Snow Flurry, when you see it all the discs in white.
Just a connected question. Like, I read that he was very impressed by visiting Mondrian, and I wonder if some of the colors were also maybe inspired or liked from both artists in the same way, or was just casualty?
I would say it's probably quite difficult to say what the real causality between that is, because I think Mondrian evolves so clearly within a particular system of symbolism, or you can so clearly trace his path to abstraction, of how abstraction really is a system of abstracting away from representation, how it goes from cubist painting and obviously the trees and the sea, and it comes to the grids, and then the grids, how they mobilize those particularly primary colors in a very stringent way. And I think there may well be a way that Calder, having first seen those arrangements, may have thought in that essentializing fashion. I mean, I think essentially if that step into abstraction that you see in the fourth room is about essentializing, and you take away mass and solidity and other components like the plinth or so from a sculpture, you would have to do the same thing on other fronts. And then when you come to colors, you will inevitably be tempted to first come to primary colors. But as Sandy said, it doesn't stop there. I think there's a sense that that is what first sort of circumscribes that palette, but actually it's far less self-restrained, I guess, than Mondrian was.
Could you say a bit more about the Schefter orchestra piece? Because I was surprised when I saw the performance that the percussionists were having to push it to move it, whereas in the catalogue seems to be a much more dynamic image of it, be it that it is a still photo.
The historic picture of it.
Yes.
So Claire's question is about the difference of the historic picture, which was during a performance when Earl Brown was alive, and the restaging of it now that both Calder, because Calder was dead when that picture was made, when both Calder and Earl Brown are now gone, and how you reinterpret, I suppose, is part of the question. Well, one of the problems we had was that the owner of the sculpture didn't want it to get damaged. So the performers here in London were instructed to not damage it. That was a challenge. But if you read the score, and you should go back and look at the Earl Brown score, get a copy of it. I'm sure it's easily available. He describes how you have to not only hit the elements, but you have to hit the rods, and you have to push the sculpture, so that you have to engage it fully, every aspect of it. It was completely welcome to hit the static stem of the bass if you wanted to. It didn't say that specifically, but it was an open form. That was the spirit of it, is that it was open. So it was really open to interpretation.
My interpretation, having read the piece in the catalogue, was that it swung more freely, and that you had to improvise different parts of the score on whichever bit presented itself to you.
Yes, and there's no absolute rigorous definition of how it's performed. Thus, it's a matter of interpretation by the performers. The conductor is the sculpture itself. And the last sequence, they get the sculpture moving most quickly towards the end, and then they are watching the sculpture and playing their percussion instruments and developing from a response to the sculpture. But every performance is unique. That's one of the most incredible things about it. And that's what inspired Earl Brown from the beginning in Calder's work. And so each performance will be unique. So maybe the next time you see it at Carnegie Hall in New York, they'll just wail on the thing. I don't know.
Just for Richard, who is the one who actually
Well, a couple of of things that we had to
translated really, because it is a really curious thing of how little instruction there is and how. I mean, I'm not musical, but the score looks not like a score to
the
me.
deep background in terms of how hard we could activate the sculpture was that we went to the Tate storerooms with one of the percussion teachers at the Guildhall School, and we tried a number of different sticks. And some of them produced a very beautiful sound, but some of them also rattled the sculpture, the Calder that Tate owns itself, a little bit more than the conservation department would have liked. And we really detailed in exhaustive length exactly what we would use and how we would respect the integrity of that chef d'orchestre sculpture.
Thank you.
So that's the first problem. If it didn't move as fast as it did in 1968, well, neither do I. Then the other point is that there are 2 pages in the score where Earl asks the percussionists to virtually imagine the sculpture, the shape of the sculpture, the leaves of each limb of the mobile, superimposed over the notes that he's composed, and to use each of those shapes to define a certain phrase. It might be ba-ba-ba or ba-ba-ba, something like that. And every time these rotate around, those musical signals
Is that the
are
music?
activated. Yes. So that will give you some idea of how the cueing process works.
Okay, can we have the last 2 questions?
3.
3. Okay, fine.
3 brief questions.
Okay,
He's got one.
okay.
Hello. Oh, hello. I just wanted to know why one of his mobiles wasn't featured here. Was it too large to bring over?
You sound like an American.
What?
Are you American?
Why one of his?
I am American. That's how I know your grandparents. I knew them very well. So, but I just wanted to.
The autos, you talk about auto sculptures.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
I just wanted to know why you haven't had one of his sculptures here. One of his, yeah.
You mean outdoors ones or
Yes.
indoors?
It was too large to bring over.
It's quite large to bring over.
What?
It's quite large to bring over. Yes, I mean, I think there are two answers to that. This exhibition never was a retrospective. There are many parts of Calder's work that are not in this exhibition. So it is a very particular take.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen any of his because I have been over here for too long, because I know there's one in Washington, D.C., but I haven't been to see any of those wonderful mobiles. So thank you.
You need to get out more.
There was.
Thank you both again. I will regret not asking you this if I don't ask you. So going back to room 2, and seeing as you're here, and seeing as you mentioned that you are someone who would be able to move the red ball, I wonder if you could be convinced to do that this evening. How could I not ask?
That's a tricky question.
We'll have to call the Prime Minister.
I'm sure that could be arranged.
Let's have another question while Achim's thinking about that.
There's one away.
I was very lucky because I came to the curator's tour, and we did see it in motion that evening. So.
Ooh. It's heating up.
I've got two very little questions and then one bigger question. The two very little questions are, firstly, are the mobiles disassembled to travel, or do they come assembled? So that's the first, just a logistical question. Second one is, why is none of the jewellery signed? Or my understanding is that none of the jewellery is signed. And the third question is bigger than the first two little questions, and that is, you talk about the uniqueness of performance. You talked about each of the musical performances is different and unique. Having seen this first mobile in action, each performance is different and unique. And I was reminded of a play where the play goes to half-time, and then the audience are given 3 different resolutions to the play and actually vote on the outcome. What was the philosophy, or what was the idea in the artist not dictating to the viewer what they were meant to see? So much more choice is left to the viewer as to the outcome. And was this a sort of an idea that Calder particularly had, not wanting to dictate the outcome to the viewer?
I like that question a lot. Is my microphone working? Yeah. I like that question a lot. I'd like to answer it this way. So when you got to the 1934 and MoMA's A Universe, essentially destroyed the intellectual aspect of all the prior 3 years' investigation, which were really investigation. They were not just making objects. The mystery was taken out of it. And Calder felt that it wasn't up to him to define your experience, let alone the beginning and the end of a sequence and so on. It's supposed to be open to the mystery of nature, the mystery of all these things. That's what he explored his entire life, things that are mysterious. He was never looking for an absolute answer. He was just exploring the question. And in exploring the question, he asked more questions of us. That's my answer to your last question. Let's see if I can remember the other two. The jewelry is frequently signed. He made a little, so Calder made beautiful jewelry. It's all unique. It's made by his own hands. You can see here in London, there's Louisa Guinness has a little gallery where she has some Calder jewelry. You should all go see some. It's extraordinary because he made precious jewelry out of unprecious materials. Mostly brass was his greatest medium. He also made some silver things and a few gold things eventually and so on, but brass was his favorite material. And he didn't sign the jewelry, except in a few cases you'll have the whole Calder signature inscribed in a necklace or something, and it's really beautiful, those signatures. But later, he made 1,800 pieces of unique jewelry, and he sold maybe a few hundred in his whole life. So later his dealer suggested they should be signed, and he developed a little cartouche, a little signature that's an S inside a C for Sandy Calder, this little informal signature that you'll find on about maybe a third of the jewelry. So you can find that. What was the first question?
Was in one piece or in elements? Both. So some of the mobiles come in one piece, and some of them come. I just tried to show you the biggest one.
But he did make them to be able to be demountable.
In many different parts.
I mean, the Brazilian one was...
Yeah. So that comes completely apart. Whereas this one probably came in about 3 pieces.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. Tomorrow I had a question back there.
Sorry, just one.
She's got a great voice. Just no mic.
No, but it doesn't record. It doesn't record for the.
No, I don't like microphones. Oh. I was wondering, when Calder had his shows when he was alive, how would he intervene a lot in the show? Was he very involved? And that made me wonder how he would have reacted to this show. I don't know if you can answer my question because he's not here, but what would you have thought? For example, the room with all the motors, would he have been frustrated that actually we couldn't get them to work? Or would he have been happy they would have been there? Or the other room with the panels, Why has it taken so long actually to have that room put together again? This is my one question.
I can try and answer that, I suppose. The exhibition is done during his lifetime. Each one's different. Earlier on, he was much more involved, like any artist would be who's younger. And then as he was older, there were many people and curatorial teams in charge of making an exhibition, just like here, where they have their own aspect and viewpoint they want to express, or a certain idea. I mean, when Achim said the show was going to end in 1948 with that beautiful piece from Brazil, I thought, well, that's an incredible thing. No one's done that since Calder died. I mean, there have been shows about a particular year or 3-year period, but to begin sort of at the beginning with wire sculpture and then say, okay, by 1948, a lot has been expressed, and that's where we want to end the show. It's an extraordinary idea. I was really excited about that. So I could tell you about specific exhibitions and things he did. Some of those things I know. Would he be thrilled by this show? Absolutely. He would have been astonished. Because the exhibitions that happened during his lifetime, the retrospectives that happened during his lifetime, I mean, at MoMA in 1943, he was 45 years old, and there wasn't that much. I mean, he produced quite a few things, but it wasn't that hard to make a really cool, comprehensive show up to that point of his life. But the other retrospectives were sort of like, what can you get and who do you know? And there was no internet, and how do you figure it out? And we sort of remember somebody, and there was that piece, but it's disappeared. And now with our document of 22,000 works, Achim's able to literally go through them. I mean, the works on paper were excluded and the jewelry was excluded, so it was more concise. But I think my grandfather would be completely astonished that someone went to the trouble to present a room of the panel paintings, for instance, just to show this almost suspended moment of time is what it feels. It's sort of a combination of the studio and that Pierre Matisse show together, this moment of what that expression was. It's super extraordinary.
I would probably give you a very different answer about that. No, I mean, only in the sense that I think it's one of the fundamental differences in terms curatorially of working with an artist or with historic work, is that with an artist you're in conversation with historic work, you're in conversation with the work, and there is no way of supposition to think what would it have been like, or it's pure speculation. However tempting that is, I think at that point the conversation really is with the work.
And do you think you'll find tonight that Josephine Baker again? How is it you think it's been destroyed? You said there's a one.
I'm an eternal optimist. That's one of the things I hate is when a curator writes in a book. They read this great book about Calder, and they have a picture from something from the 30s, and they write underneath, destroyed. Well, how the hell do they know it's destroyed? Or missing. Missing to whom? To itself, it's not missing, right? So I like location unknown, and that leaves it open. We don't know where it is, and maybe it's not even extant. We're not sure. But I've worked extensively to try and find that sculpture, and it failed thus far.
Okay.
I have a last question.
Oh, that's very cheeky. Let's first see before your last question. Anybody else who has a question? Front row. Hang on.
Obviously, we would prefer to see everything moving the way it was meant to. Have there ever been recreations of the pieces that were motorized or that he meant for people to interact with so that people could now play? Or is that kind of antithetical to how you like to work with the work?
Well, the works are not ours. The works are Calder's. The works that we own are in our care, and we have to preserve them for the future. So you can't have people engage them. But it's a very difficult thing, and it's the Calder Foundation, our biggest criticism is that we kept someone from engaging the work the way the artist intended. But yet, at the same time, we could put everything in a dark drawer and preserve it for the future. But it's some sort of middle ground has to be achieved, where you motorize a work for 5 minutes, make a video, and present it on a screen so you can understand what the composition is and have a sense of it. It's a big, big challenge.
But have there been efforts to recreate elements of them?
Whether you would make exhibition copies of mobiles, which is something which people ask time and again.
Yeah.
Whether we should have had replicas of mobiles just for people to interact with, which I have to say, as as a museums person, I think exhibitions are about showing works. So it's something in me slightly.
There are two kinds of people. One kind of person believes in the uniqueness and the energetic expression of a physical object. And the other people believe a copy is just the same.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that it sounds very much like his work were the physical pieces, but his work was also very much about that interaction. So if it's not so much about copying to create a copy as if it's the same thing, but as a way for a viewer, a visitor, to actually experience that interaction as a way to experience the piece.
Have you seen the show?
Yes, I love it.
It's a fair point. It's an interesting question. Right. Tamara's last question, and then I think everybody's allowed to go home.
I was wondering if
A little louder, I can't hear you.
I was wondering if the foundation would ever be a place that would be where the public could come and look at different Calders. If it would be a museum, a kind of museum.
It's hard to know.
Thank
I
you.
mean, the Calder Foundation, as it is in New York, is not a public place. It cannot be a public place. It's a scholarly operation. It's not so grand. You know, we have works of art there. We don't have guards. We don't put them on plinths and so forth. So a curator like Achim Borchardt-Hume or Anne came and did lots of research and engaged the archives, the original documents, not reading them on a screen, but the physical paper, which we believe has a resonance, just like the sculptures do, and then the works and so on. So it's very, very difficult for us to do a public engagement other than these types of projects. I mean, last year we did, I think, 15 exhibitions in 2015. So our audience is about 2.6 million people in a year. So we have a virtual museum, but not a literal Calder Foundation museum.
At which point I would like to thank Sandy for being here,
Thank you very much.
for being in conversation, and I would like to, hang on, I shouldn't interrupt your but also I would like to thank you all actually for your interest in Calder, which is very heartening, and for coming to Tate Modern. Thank you.